I grew up in a small town pressed deep into the folds of the Appalachian Mountains, where every night the woods creaked with a voice of their own, and every elder had a story they swore was true. You do not need to search long in Appalachia to find someone willing to whisper a warning about the hills, about the shadows, about the strange things that walk when the sun dips beneath the ridgeline. I was one of those people who laughed it off, until I started hearing and seeing things that no laughter could cover. There is a weight in the mountains, a heaviness that settles over you like fog. When you are driving late at night, headlights bouncing off endless trees, the silence is never complete. You swear you hear something pacing the car, just out of sight, keeping stride with you. When you stop, that sound stops too. The first story I ever heard that chilled me came from a man named Roy, a hunter who had lived his whole life in the mountains and who swore he would never again go into the forest alone. He told me it happened one October when the air smelled like cold iron and the leaves burned red and orange in the trees. He had gone out at dawn, shotgun slung over his shoulder, certain he would return by noon with venison. The hunt went as it always did, until he found himself tracking deeper than he meant to, following hoof prints that seemed almost to lead him. Hours passed and he realized he did not recognize the trees anymore. That was when the woods grew too quiet. Roy said he felt it first, an awareness pressing in, the sense that eyes were fixed on his back. He turned and swore he saw a pale figure behind the trees, but when he blinked, it was gone. He thought it must be another hunter, maybe even a trespasser, until he realized there had been no sound of boots, no smell of cigarettes. Nothing human at all, he tried to call out, but his voice seemed to die in the air. What chilled him most was the laughter. It did not sound right. It was high-pitched, broken, almost childlike, but warped with something older. It echoed through the trees, though he could not tell where it came from. He ran. He admitted it without shame. He dropped the deer tracks and bolted, tripping over roots, slamming his shoulder against trunks, not stopping until he saw the familiar stream that cut behind his cabin. Even then he swore he heard it, that laughter soft and close. Following him all the way to his door, he never went back to that part of the forest. He said it belonged to something else. I believed Roy because his hands shook when he told it. A man who had gutted deer in freezing rain but trembled at memory. And the thing about Appalachia is that Roy is not the only one. Everyone has a story that feels too strange to dismiss. And sometimes when you hear enough of them, they start to overlap. I had my own when I was 23. My friends and I had decided to camp near an old trail that wound around an abandoned mine. We thought it was a joke, a dare to spend the night in a place locals refused to. They said the mine was cursed, that too many men had gone missing in those tunnels back in the day, and that some had never left at all. We laughed, we brought beer, a tent, and a flashlight that would later fail us when we needed it most. That night was colder than it should have been. The fire cracked but never seemed to throw enough warmth. Every gust of wind carried a metallic taste like blood. We tried to ignore it, told scary stories like kids around the flames. At some point past midnight, I heard something in the distance. At first, I thought it was an owl, low and hollow, but it grew into something that sounded like breathing. I walked toward the mine entrance with a friend, both of us too stubborn to admit we were scared. The closer we got, the more the air seemed to thicken. I felt like I was breathing through wet cloth. My flashlight flickered, then went black. My friend's light kept shaking as his hand trembled, and in that trembling beam we both saw it. Two eyes reflecting low to the ground but unblinking. They weren't the eyes of a raccoon or fox. They were too far apart, too large, and when they blinked, it was sideways, not like anything we knew. We ran. But the sound followed, footsteps heavy and dragging, like something pulling itself from the mine to chase us. We did not stop until we reached the fire where the others sat, half asleep. We tried to explain, but the woods swallowed the proof. No sound, no eyes. Nothing but our racing hearts. Still, neither of us slept that night. Every time the fire dimmed, I swore I saw those eyes at the tree line, waiting. When dawn came, the mine looked the same. An open wound in the hillside, rotting timber around its mouth. But we swore we would never return. Some places in Appalachia are sick with history, and you feel it in your bones when you stand there too long. Another story that has never left me came from a woman named Clara, who lived 2 towns over. She was older, white hair pinned back tight, the kind who never wasted words. She told me about the night she lost her brother when they were kids. A story she said she never shared outside her family. They had gone chasing fireflies near the creek, their mother yelling to be back before dark, but they lingered too long. And as the shadows grew, the woods turned mean. Clara swore she saw a man step from behind the trees, but not a man like she knew. He was too thin, his arms too long. His face blurred in memory as if she could never quite focus on it. Her brother ran to him, thinking it was their father come to fetch them. But when the figure reached down, Clara screamed. She said its hand bent backward wrong, the fingers curling the wrong way. Her scream startled her brother, who hesitated long enough for her to grab his sleeve and pull him back. They ran, stumbling over roots, hearts hammering. When they burst into the clearing near their home, their mother was already waiting, pale with worry, Clara tried to explain. But their father was inside, asleep in his chair. Whatever had tried to lure her brother, it was not him to this day. She believes the mountains have things in them that mimic, that wear familiar shapes to draw you in. Her brother never spoke of it again. He grew up and left the mountains, refusing to return. Clara stayed. But she never went near the creek after dark. Stories like Clara's echo through Appalachia. Some call them folklore, some swear they are warnings. But when you grow up here, the line between myth and truth blurs until they are the same. You stop asking if it is real and start asking if it will find you. I remember another night when a friend told me about her cousin, a boy who loved to hike alone. He knew every trail, every ridge, thought nothing in the woods could scare him, but one evening he came home shaking, face pale, unable to form words. When he finally spoke, he said he had seen a figure standing on the trail ahead, dressed in rags, skin too pale for someone who lived out there. It did not move when he called out, it only tilted its head. Like an animal studying him, he turned to walk away. But every time he looked back, it was closer, not walking, not running, just closer. He sprinted the last mile home, certain it would grab him, drag him into the trees. He never hiked alone again. Some might say it was exhaustion, a trick of the light. But when you have grown up hearing the same types of stories, you start to wonder how many people can be wrong in the same way. How many tricks of the mind can leave claw marks on your memory that never fade? That is Appalachia, a place where beauty and terror share the same soil, where legends are not just told but lived, whispered down generations until they harden into truth. I never thought I would add my own story to the pile, but one night, years later, I did. I was 27 when I moved back home after years away. The mountains felt both familiar and foreign. Like an old friend you no longer knew how to talk to. I stayed in a small rental cabin just outside of town, perched against the edge of the woods. At night, the crickets were deafening, the cicadas humming like a chorus. And then sometimes, in a moment that felt too sudden, everything would stop. That silence was worse than any sound, as if the mountains themselves were holding their breath. My first week there, I woke up around 2 in the morning to tapping on the window. I thought it was branches brushing in the wind, until I remembered that side of the cabin faced only the yard. No trees close enough to reach the glass. I lay frozen, staring at the curtains, waiting for the noise again. It came, 3 slow taps, deliberate, patient. I told myself it had to be my imagination. Maybe the house settling until the sound shifted. The tapping scraped downward this time. As if a fingernail dragged across the glass, I jumped from bed, grabbed the baseball bat I kept by the door, and yanked the curtains open. Nothing. Just black yard and the faint silver of moonlight. Still, I knew something had been there. The next morning I checked outside. No footprints, no signs of anything, but the glass bore faint scratches. 3 lines carved shallowly into the pane. I could not explain it, and I never forgot it. Living alone in Appalachia means you come face to face with the weight of the land. Some call it superstition, but others call it memory. Old places remember. And sometimes they remind you, one memory I cannot shake belongs to a man named Henry, who worked maintenance for the county roads. He drove trucks up narrow mountain paths where a single wrong turn could send you tumbling into ravines. He swore he once gave a ride to something that wasn't human. It was a foggy morning, mist curling like smoke over the trees. He was headed toward a stretch of road near an abandoned church when he saw a figure walking. It was unusual. Few people hiked that far, especially in weather like that, out of habit. Henry slowed and offered a ride. The figure climbed in, silent, draped in clothes so ragged they looked decades old. The smell of damp earth filled the cab, stronger than any mud he had driven through. Henry tried to make conversation, but the passenger only nodded. The man's hands were pale, almost gray, with long nails that scraped faintly against the dashboard. When Henry glanced sideways, he realized he could not make out the man's face. It blurred, like heat rising off pavement, shifting whenever he tried to focus. He drove in silence until he reached the fork where the church stood. The passenger suddenly turned, lifted a hand, and pointed toward the church. His finger was bent wrong, joint swollen and sharp, more claw than hand. Henry swore his stomach dropped. An instinct told him not to stop, not to turn. He pressed the gas, ignoring the man's silent pointing. When he finally glanced back, the seat was empty. He stopped the truck, heart hammering, but there was no sign of anyone on the road. No footprints in the wet dirt, no door ever opening. For weeks after, Henry dreamed of that passenger pointing, always toward the abandoned church. He never drove that road again without company. Some stories cling to buildings the way ivy clings to stone. Old homes in Appalachia carry layers of history, and sometimes that history refuses to leave. My cousin lived in a house built in the early 1900s, a sagging structure with crooked floors and a basement that smelled of mold. They said the house had once belonged to a family that vanished in the 1950s, no record of where they went. My cousin moved in anyway, stubborn and broke, thinking ghosts were nothing but tales. The first night, she noticed doors that would not stay shut. She locked them, latched them, wedged chairs under the handles, yet by morning they gaped open. She laughed it off until she started hearing voices. At first faint whispers, like neighbors talking outside, but the house stood alone on the hill. The whispers grew louder, clear enough to make out her name. One night, she followed the sound to the basement door. It stood wide open, though she had nailed it shut a week earlier. The whispers drifted up, soft and urgent, calling her down. She swore she almost obeyed, her foot hovering over the first step before she caught herself. She slammed the door, nailed it twice over, and packed her bags by dawn. She never looked back, and to this day, that house still sits empty, the basement waiting. Locals cross the street rather than walk in front of it. Everyone whispers that the family who vanished never really left, that they are still waiting in the basement for someone foolish enough to come down. Fear in Appalachia is not always in the houses or the mines. Sometimes it lives in the open, under the sky itself. A friend of mine, Tom, once told me about the night he and his brother camped in a clearing high on the ridge. They set up their tent, lit a fire, and leaned back to watch the stars. But the stars did not feel right that night. They looked sharper, closer, as if leaning down to see them sometime after midnight. Tom woke to silence so complete it hurt his ears. The fire was cold, though he swore it should have burned longer. He crawled out of the tent and froze. The clearing was ringed with figures tall, thin shapes standing just beyond the tree line. They did not move, did not breathe, but their eyes glowed faintly like embers. Tom shook his brother awake. But when his brother looked, the clearing was empty. No figures, no glowing eyes, just the endless trees. They packed up before sunrise and never camped there again. Tom swore it was not a dream, that the memory was too sharp, the fear too real. He still wakes sweating when he thinks about it. I thought he might have imagined it. Until years later I spoke to a hunter who swore he saw the same figures on that same ridge. He would not hunt near it anymore. He said those were watchers, guardians of the mountains, and that if you saw them once, it meant they had chosen to let you leave. He added, almost as a warning, that not everyone gets chosen. Every person I meet in these mountains has a story. Some speak freely, others only after a long silence. But they all carry it, the sense that something else lives here, something older than us, something that watches. And when you hear enough of them, you start to realize these stories are not scattered. They are threads weaving together into a larger truth. I sometimes think about the night my uncle disappeared. He was not the kind of man to vanish without a trace. He worked hard, drank little, and loved to sit on the porch and tell us stories about the war. But one autumn night, he went walking in the woods and never returned. We searched, of course. Dogs, men, helicopters, nothing, no tracks, no clothes, no body, just gone. The sheriff called it misadventure. The family called it bad luck. But I remember the way my grandmother's eyes went dark when she heard the news. She whispered something under her breath. Words I could not catch, and she never spoke of him again. Locals said the mountain took him, that some debts are older than memory, and that once the hills claim someone, you do not ask for them back. I used to scoff at that, but as the years pass, I find myself wondering if they were right, because Appalachia is not a place you conquer. It is a place you survive if it allows you to. And every story I have heard, every tale whispered by firelight, is a reminder that the mountains have their own rules, and those rules are not ours. When I was 19, I spent a summer working trails for the Park Service. It was long days of clearing brush, repainting signs, and making sure tourists did not wander into places they should not. I loved it though, the feeling of the dirt under my boots. The air so heavy with pine you could taste it. But there was one trail we avoided unless ordered to go. Not because it was dangerous or overgrown, but because it felt wrong. It was a narrow path that twisted up along a ridge, with sharp drops on both sides. Locals called it Crow's Spine, though no official maps gave it a name. The first time I hiked it, I thought the nickname came from the way blackbirds always circled above. But the deeper I went, the quieter the woods grew, until I realized there were no sounds at all, no birds, no bugs. Just the crunch of my boots one afternoon. My supervisor asked me to check that trail. A storm had knocked down trees, and tourists might try wandering in if we did not block it off. I set out alone with a saw strapped to my pack. Halfway up, the air changed. It grew heavy, thick, like walking underwater. The silence pressed into my ears. Then I saw something that made my chest tighten. Carved into one of the trees along the path was a symbol, not initials or hearts like kids usually scratched, but something older, a circle split with jagged lines. Burned black into the bark, I stopped staring at it. And that was when I noticed more. Tree after tree, all marked with the same symbol. As far as I could see, I do not remember deciding to leave. But suddenly my feet were moving faster. Pounding back down the trail, the silence followed me. And though I tried not to look back, I swear I felt eyes on me. When I returned to camp, I told my supervisor. He went pale, shook his head, and told me not to mention it again years later. I asked one of the older rangers about it. He told me Crow's Spine had been avoided for generations. Hunters would not track game near it. Hikers who wandered that way sometimes did not come back. He said the symbols were warnings, not marks, carved by people long gone. Warnings to stay away. The mountains are filled with warnings. If you know how to see them, some come in the form of old stories, passed from mouth to mouth, changing with each telling. I once sat with a woman in her 80s who swore she remembered when her father vanished into the mines. He had been a miner his whole life, working shafts that dug like veins through the earth. But one morning he went in and never came out. The company blamed a collapse, but no one found rubble. No cave-in, no tools left behind, just his lantern, flickering at the mouth of a side tunnel, and the faint echo of something moving deeper in the dark. She said her father was not the first. Others had gone missing in those mines, men swallowed whole, their names spoken in whispers at dinner tables. She told me her mother once said the mountain was alive, that it demanded sacrifices, and when the miners' lights disappeared into the dark, it was not rockfalls that took them. It was something older, something waiting. Her words haunted me long after. Maybe it was the way her eyes never left the floor, or maybe it was the way her voice trembled on the word waiting, like she still heard it echoing from that tunnel. I told myself I did not believe her, but months later, I read an old newspaper clipping about miners missing in that same shaft. Their bodies never recovered. The article never mentioned superstition, but it was there in the silence between lines. Appalachia is good at hiding what it knows. Sometimes, though, the land shows you outright. A man named Caleb once told me about his hunting trip in the late 90s. He had gone alone, hiking high into the ridges where deer were plentiful. Around dusk, he made camp and sat by his fire. Cleaning his rifle, that was when he heard singing. Not birds, not the wind, singing a low, wordless hum that drifted through the trees. He thought maybe another hunter was nearby, but the sound was too strange. It rose and fell without rhythm, a voice without breath. He stood, shined his flashlight, but the woods stretched empty. Still, the song came closer. He swore it felt like it was circling him. though no footsteps touched the ground. Finally, in a panic, he fired a shot into the air. The song stopped. Silence swallowed the clearing. Caleb packed his gear and left that night. Stumbling down the ridge by moonlight, when he told locals what happened, one old man shook his head and said, "You are lucky it stopped. If it had kept singing, you would not be here. Appalachia is filled with sounds that should not exist. Whistles in the night, voices calling your name when no one is there, drums echoing faint through the hills. My grandfather used to warn us never to answer when the woods called. If the mountain wants you, he said, you do not give it permission." I once ignored that advice. I was camping with 2 friends near a creek, the water running soft enough to lull us into sleep. Sometime around 3 in the morning, I woke to a voice outside the tent, a woman's voice, clear, calm. Saying my name, I froze. My friends were asleep. The voice came again, closer this time, just beyond the nylon wall. Against every instinct, I whispered, "What?" The moment the word left my lips, the creek fell silent. The air thickened, heavy as stone, then laughter. Low, cruel, too close, I shook my friends awake, and together we bolted from the tent, sprinting through the dark with no light, no direction. We did not stop until we reached the road. Lungs burning, legs torn by branches. To this day, I do not know what waited by that creek, but I know it was not human, and I know I was wrong to answer. Not all stories are told by those who escape. Some are pieced together from what little is left behind. There was a family who lived near my cousin's town, in a house that backed against the woods. One night, their neighbors heard screaming, high, sharp, cut off too suddenly. When they went to check, the house was empty. Inside, dishes still sat on the table. A lamp still glowed by the chair. The front door was open, and muddy prints led from the woods into the kitchen. They stopped halfway across the floor, as if whatever made them had vanished into the air. The sheriff filed it under missing persons, but no one in town believed they left on their own. Whispers spread about the woods behind their home, about the shadows people claimed to see moving through the trees. The house still stands, but no one will buy it at night. Locals say they hear screams echoing faintly from the hill, the same screams that ended too suddenly years before. I think often of that house, standing silent at the edge of the woods, of how many homes like it scatter these mountains, each with its own untold story. They are reminders that Appalachia does not forget. It holds on to everything, every voice, every footprint, every scream, and sometimes when you walk alone through the trees, you can feel it, that weight pressing in, that silence waiting to break, that sense that someone else is there, just beyond your sight watching, because here, the stories are not just tales, they are warnings, and those warnings are written in every scratch on a window, every voice in the dark, every figure standing too still among the trees. I had a friend named Jason who grew up in the heart of Appalachia. His family's property stretched across a wide patch of ridges and hollows, with a creek that ran like silver through the land. He used to love wandering those woods as a boy, learning every tree, every bend of the water, until he felt he knew the forest like his own body. But there was one spot, he told me, that never felt like it belonged. It was an open clearing halfway up a slope. No bigger than a living room, nothing grew there but dead grass, brittle and gray, no matter the season. The trees around it bent inward like they were leaning to block it from sight. Jason said whenever he stepped into that space, the air grew hot and tight. Like standing too close to a fire, his chest would ache. His thoughts would twist. One summer when he was about 16, he dared himself to camp there overnight. He wanted to prove the stories wrong, the ones his grandfather whispered about curses and land that remembers blood. He pitched a small tent, built a fire, and lay down with his flashlight at his side. At first, nothing happened. The night insects hummed, the flames cracked, and he started to drift. But around midnight, he woke to a sound like someone breathing just outside the tent. He froze, holding his breath, straining his ears. The sound grew louder, heavy and wet, like lungs struggling through water. He unzipped the flap just enough to peek out. The fire had burned low, throwing long shadows, and in those shadows he saw something crouched at the edge of the clearing. Its body was human in shape but wrong in proportion. Arms too long, back arched like a broken spine. Its head tilted side to side, jerking unnaturally as if searching for him. Jason said he did not move, not even to blink. until the thing let out a wheeze so deep his skin prickled. Then it crawled backward into the trees, movement spidery, until it was swallowed by the dark. He left the clearing before dawn and never returned. His grandfather told him later that some land was marked, places where old things still held ground. "That space is not for you," the old man said. "It belongs to what came before," Jason swore to me years later. He could still hear the sound of that breathing whenever he closed his eyes. Stories like his are not rare in the hills. Many of them are tied to the land itself. Appalachia is full of abandoned places, houses, barns, churches left to rot beneath the trees. Each one holds a silence that feels heavier than the rest of the forest. I remember driving with my cousin one autumn and passing such a place. It was a church, its white paint long peeled, its windows boarded, the steeple leaned crooked, the bell gone. We stopped on the shoulder, curiosity pulling us out of the car. The air inside the churchyard was still, unnaturally so. No birds, no wind, just the soft creak of the boards beneath our feet. The doors were locked, but the side window hung loose. My cousin, braver than me, climbed in. I followed reluctantly, the smell of mildew and dust filling my nose. The interior was stripped bare, no pews, no altar, just a hollow shell. But etched into the walls were words, hundreds of them, carved deep with knives. Most were names, some were dates. And in the back, larger than the rest, were the words, "Do not pray here." I asked my cousin if he thought it was a joke. He shook his head. The cuts in the wood were old, deep, like generations of hands had carved them. We left quickly, but when we reached the road, I realized something that froze me. The inside of the church had been silent, but I had felt watched the entire time. And now, standing outside, the woods around us seemed to hum, faint and low, like dozens of voices whispering all at once. We got in the car and drove without looking back. Later, when we mentioned the church to locals, a woman crossed herself and told us to stay away. She said the congregation had vanished decades ago, that one by one, they disappeared after a single Sunday service. "They went inside," she whispered, "but they did not come back out." Her words stayed with me for years. That church still stands, as far as I know, leaning against time, waiting for someone else to wander too close. But it is not just buildings or clearings that hold danger here. Sometimes the danger moves, following you like a shadow you cannot shake. A man named Peter once told me about the figure that haunted his drive home. He worked nights at a factory and often drove the winding mountain road back around 3 a.m. For months he noticed the same thing. A man standing at the same bend, wearing a dark coat, head lowered at first. Peter thought he was imagining it, the way headlights played tricks. But one night as he slowed for the curve, the figure lifted its head. Its face was smooth, too smooth, like wax without features, no eyes, no mouth, just a blank surface that caught the light. Peter swerved, nearly crashing, and when he looked back in the mirror, the road was empty. It happened again the next week. Then again, always at the same curve, always at the same hour. Sometimes the figure stood closer to the road, as if edging nearer each time. Peter stopped driving that route altogether, adding 20 minutes to his commute just to avoid it. When he told an older co-worker, the man nodded grimly. "That bend has a name," he said, "Ghost's Turn. Folks say a man died there years ago, but what you saw, that is not him. That is something wearing his memory." Peter's voice shook when he told me. He said even now, when he drives anywhere at night, he cannot stop himself from checking every curve, every shadow, afraid he will see that blank face waiting again. The mountains are old, older than memory, older than story. They hold echoes of everything that has happened upon them, both human and not. Sometimes I wonder if the land itself remembers us, our steps, our voices, our fears, and plays them back when it chooses. I once hiked a ridge with a friend who loved photography. We camped near the top, overlooking miles of rolling hills. That night, while he fiddled with his camera, I stepped away to relieve myself. The air was still, the sky full of stars, but when I turned back toward camp, I froze. There were 3 tents glowing faintly in the dark. We only had 2. I stood heart-pounding, staring at the 3rd tent, which flickered with dim light as though a lantern burned inside. My friend was still at the fire, muttering to himself, unaware. I whispered his name, but when he looked at me, the 3rd tent was gone, just empty space, the fire casting shadows. I did not sleep that night, and when morning came, I avoided mentioning it, but as we packed, I saw my friend glancing at the same spot. His brow furrowed. I asked him what was wrong. He shook his head slowly and said, "Did you hear it? Someone whispering in the dark." I lied and told him no, but I had heard it. Soft voices drifting from where that tent had stood. And I knew then that whatever lives in these hills is not always bound to shape. Sometimes it borrows ours, sometimes it slips through, just enough to remind us we are not alone. There was a boy I went to high school with named Tyler who swore he had seen something in the woods behind his grandmother's house. At the time, I brushed it off as bragging, a way to make himself stand out in a small town where everyone knew everyone's business. But years later, when I ran into him again, his story hadn't changed. If anything, the way his voice trembled told me it had only gotten heavier with time. He said he was 14 when it happened. His grandmother lived in a weather-beaten cabin perched on the edge of a steep slope. Her backyard fading into forest that night. She sent him outside to fetch firewood. The moon was bright, shining silver across the yard, and Tyler could see every branch of the woodpile, but as he bent to lift a log, he felt a prickling sensation at the back of his neck. When he looked up, there was someone standing at the tree line. Not a neighbor, not a hunter, but a tall, thin figure, pale against the dark. Its arms dangled lower than they should have, and its head tilted in an unnatural angle, as though it were studying him with curiosity. Tyler froze, clutching the wood. The figure didn't move. It didn't even seem to breathe. He tried to convince himself it was a tree stump or a trick of the moonlight. But then it took a single step forward. The movement was deliberate, smooth, and his blood turned to ice. He dropped the logs and bolted inside, slamming the door. His grandmother asked what was wrong, but when he tried to explain, she simply frowned and told him not to go outside after dark again. Later that night, lying in bed, he swore he heard footsteps pacing across the porch. Years later, when I asked why he had never told anyone else, Tyler said he didn't need to. He had seen enough to know the stories our grandparents whispered were not just tales. That thing, he told me, it was waiting, and I think it still is. What struck me most was the way his eyes darted toward the woods even as he spoke, as though expecting it to appear at any moment. Stories like Tyler's bleed into others, shared like warnings. I once spoke to an older man named Howard, who claimed the hills around his home were filled with watchers. He didn't mean deer or coyotes. He meant people, or what looked like people, who stood in the shadows just out of reach. Howard lived alone in a hollow, his nearest neighbor a mile away. He spent his evenings on the porch, smoking his pipe. One night, he noticed a figure standing across the creek. It was too dark to see details, just the outline of someone tall and still. He called out, thinking it might be a trespasser, but the figure didn't answer. It didn't move at all. For 3 nights it returned, always at the same spot, always silent. On the 4th night, Howard walked across the creek with his shotgun. But when he reached the spot, the figure was gone. The ground was dry, no tracks, no sign anyone had been there. From then on, he said, the watchers changed positions, sometimes on the ridge, sometimes at the tree line, sometimes closer. They never came all the way to the porch, but they never left either. Howard told me he no longer looked for them. If you see it once, you can't unsee it, he said. Best thing is to pretend it ain't there. That same hollow had another story attached to it, one that still unsettles me. A young couple moved into a trailer nearby, eager to start a new life away from town. For months, things were quiet. Then they started hearing tapping on their windows at night. At first, they thought it was branches in the wind. But one evening, the woman drew back the curtain and saw a face pressed against the glass. She screamed, but when her husband ran outside, the yard was empty. No footprints, no signs of anyone. The tapping continued for weeks, always after midnight, always just enough to jolt them from sleep. Finally, unable to take it, they packed their things and left in the middle of the night. Locals say the trailer still stands, abandoned and rotting, and sometimes if you drive by slow enough, you'll see shadows flicker in the windows, like something inside is still waiting for someone to return. I cannot count the number of stories in Appalachia that end with abandonment. Houses left behind, cabins sealed, trails avoided. It is as though the land itself selects what it will tolerate, and when it tires of us, it drives us out. I remember once hiking a back trail with two friends when we came across a house deep in the woods, one not marked on any map. It was a two-story farmhouse, its roof sagging, its windows boarded. Curiosity got the better of us, and we crept closer. The front door was cracked, swinging slightly in the wind. Inside, the air was damp and heavy, filled with the smell of rot. The wallpaper peeled, and the floors groaned with every step. We thought it was just another abandoned home until we reached the staircase. Pinned to the wall was a series of photographs, old, faded Polaroids, dozens of them. Each one showed people standing in the same clearing, families, couples, children, all staring at the camera with stiff, lifeless expressions, and in every photo, behind them in the trees, there was the same shadowy figure. We didn't linger. As we rushed out, I swear I felt eyes on us from the second floor, though no one followed. When we reached the trail again, none of us spoke for a long time. To this day, I don't know who took those photographs or what became of the people in them. That is the nature of these mountains. They hide secrets too heavy to carry, yet they press them into you all the same. I heard another tale from a woman who worked as a nurse in a small mountain town. She said a patient came in one night, his face pale with terror, his hands trembling. He refused to explain at first, but after some coaxing, he told her he had been driving home when he saw a woman standing in the road. She wore a long dress, old-fashioned, and her hair was tangled. He slammed the brakes, but she didn't move. Instead, she walked slowly toward the car. Her face was hidden in shadow until she leaned down toward the windshield. That's when he saw she had no eyes, just smooth skin where they should have been. He screamed, floored the gas, and drove straight through her. He expected the thud of impact, but there was nothing. When he looked back, the road was empty. The nurse told me he refused to leave his house for weeks after. Even when he returned to work, he would not drive at night. He said he still saw her sometimes, standing at the edges of his dreams. The people who live here, who grow up with these stories, learn not to question too much. They learn to respect the shadows, to keep their eyes lowered when walking the woods after dark. There is a sense that the mountains watch back, and if you stare too long, you might not like what you see. Even I, someone who has spent years collecting these stories, feel it when I walk the ridges, a tension beneath the earth, a presence that is older than us, older than the towns and the cabins and the churches, something that lingers, patient, waiting for the moment we let our guard down. I used to work with a man named Dennis, who grew up in a town pressed so deep into the hills, it barely qualified as a town at all. A gas station, a post office, a handful of houses clinging to the ridges like they were afraid of falling into the valleys below. Dennis told me the scariest night of his life started with something as ordinary as walking home. He was 18, just finished a late shift at the gas station. His truck wouldn't start, so he decided to take the shortcut on foot through a wooded path that led straight to his back porch. He had walked that path hundreds of times, but that night the air felt different. He said it was quiet. Too quiet. No insects, no rustle of leaves, no distant hoot of an owl, just silence that pressed against his ears like cotton. Halfway through the woods, he caught sight of something on the trail ahead. At first, he thought it was another person, maybe a neighbor, but the longer he stared, the less it looked right. It stood tall, its arms too long, shoulders hunched. Its head lolled from side to side like it didn't quite fit on its body. Dennis said he froze, his feet wouldn't move, and his chest locked tight. The figure started to sway, slowly, side to side, then forward, then back, almost like it was mimicking the branches around it. Except there was no wind that night. Then it let out a sound. Not words, not even a growl, just a low, deep hum that rattled his teeth. That was enough. Dennis bolted, running so fast he tripped twice, cutting his palms on sharp rock. When he finally burst out of the woods into his backyard, he didn't look back. But even inside his house with the door bolted, he swore he heard that humming, vibrating through the walls like it had followed him. He told me he never walked that path again. It's easy to dismiss stories like Dennis's as exaggeration, but when you hear them echoed in different towns, from different voices, the pattern becomes hard to ignore. A woman named Grace told me a similar story, though hers took place on a lonely stretch of road between two mountain towns. She was driving home late at night after visiting her sister. The road twisted along the ridges, no streetlights, just her headlights cutting through the black. About halfway home, she saw something standing at the shoulder. At first, she thought it was a deer, but as she slowed, she realized it was standing upright, a person, or at least it looked like one. It stepped into the road, forcing her to slam the brakes. She sat there, headlights washing over it. She said its skin looked gray, almost translucent, like it had been stretched too thin over bones. Its hair hung in clumps, wet and stringy, and it stared at her with eyes that reflected white like an animal's. She tried to reverse, but the figure dropped to all fours and crawled toward her car with unnatural speed. Grace panicked, flooring the gas and swerving around it. She didn't slow down until she hit town, hands shaking so hard she could barely keep the wheel steady when she told the story later. Her cousin admitted he'd seen something similar on that same stretch of road, something that crawled like it belonged in the trees. Not on the ground. Roads like that seem to hold their own legends. I heard one about a place locals call Devil's Curve, a sharp bend along a mountain highway. They say if you drive too slowly at night, something climbs onto your car. People report hearing scraping along the roof, like nails dragging across metal. Some even claim they've seen handprints appear on their windows. One trucker said he made the mistake of slowing for the curve after midnight. He felt the truck shift, like weight had settled on it. The cab shook. He didn't look, didn't dare, he just hit the accelerator, praying the engine wouldn't stall. When he finally reached the next town, he pulled over. The roof was covered in scratches, deep gouges, like something with claws had been clinging to the top. He refused to drive that route again. Appalachia is full of roads like Devil's Curve, places where the land itself seems to test you, to remind you that not every path is meant for people. And when you ignore those warnings, you don't always make it back the same. But it's not only roads and woods. Sometimes the horrors creep right into people's homes. I once interviewed a woman named Lila who lived in a century-old farmhouse passed down through her family. She said she never believed in ghosts, not until she had her first child. Her baby's crib sat in the corner of her bedroom, and every night she would wake to the sound of footsteps in the hallway. At first, she blamed her husband until she realized he was fast asleep beside her. Then she thought it might be the house settling, but one night, she woke to find her baby staring toward the door. Wide-eyed and silent, Lila turned her head and froze. The door was cracked open, and in the sliver of moonlight, she saw a figure standing there, tall, thin, with its head tilted like it was listening. She screamed, and the figure melted back into the shadows. Her husband leapt up, but the hallway was empty. No sound of retreating steps, no open windows, nothing after that. She said the baby would not sleep unless a light was on. And sometimes, even in daylight, Lila would catch shadows slipping across the floor, vanishing before she could turn her head. Some families move when these things happen. But Lila stayed. She said the land was hers, her family's, and she would not be driven away. Still, the way her voice dropped to a whisper told me she was not certain she'd won that battle. That stubbornness runs deep in the mountains. People will endure almost anything rather than give up their homes. But sometimes the price is steep. I met a man named Samuel in a bar one winter night. He was quiet, nursing his drink, until he heard me ask about strange experiences in the hills. His shoulders stiffened, and after a long silence, he told me about his brother. They were boys when it happened, playing near an abandoned coal tipple, chasing each other through the ruins. His brother ran ahead, disappeared around a corner, and when Samuel followed, he was gone. He called and searched, heart pounding, but there was no trace. Minutes stretched into hours. The town organized a search party, combing the woods. They found nothing. 3 days later, his brother stumbled out of the forest. His clothes were torn, his skin scratched and dirty, but when they asked where he'd been, he couldn't answer. He just stared blankly, eyes wide, lips trembling. Even after he recovered, he never spoke of it. Not once. He grew up quiet, withdrawn, like part of him had been left behind in the woods. Samuel swore his brother had not been the same since. Whatever took him, he said, didn't give all of him back. That line has haunted me ever since. It makes me wonder how many of the people we see every day carry scars we cannot see. How many have brushed against something in these mountains and come back altered, their silence a way to protect themselves, or us from the truth the stories pile up, each stranger than the last. But what ties them together is a sense that the land here remembers. It holds things we try to bury, and it has a way of giving them back when we least expect it. Every time I leave the mountains, I feel a lightness, like a weight lifting from my shoulders. But every time I return, that weight settles again, and I know I am not alone in feeling it. These hills do not let you forget. I used to think of Appalachia as a place of warmth, a place where my grandparents' stories of campfires, fishing trips, and mountain hymns painted a picture of comfort. But there are shadows in these hills, deeper than any nightfall. I discovered that firsthand in 2004, when I was 27 years old and chasing what I thought would be the adventure of a lifetime. I had recently moved to eastern Tennessee for work, and I was still intoxicated by the wildness of the mountains. Every weekend, I hiked trails alone, convincing myself I was blending with the land the way the old-timers once did. It was late September when I decided to push myself further than usual. I had read about an old, unofficial path branching off near a forgotten fire tower in Cherokee National Forest. Supposedly, if you followed it long enough, it would lead you to an abandoned homestead, a relic from when settlers first pushed into the mountains. That combination of history and solitude hooked me. I packed light, carried a flashlight, a flask of water, and a jacket, and drove out before dawn. The hike started beautifully, crisp air nipping at my cheeks, the trees glowing with the early reds and oranges of fall. The forest was nearly silent except for my boots crunching leaves and the distant rush of a creek. But as I got deeper, the air thickened, pressing against me in a way that was hard to ignore. The marked trail was lively with bird calls and distant squirrels. The unmarked one was not. When I finally found the fork, a barely noticeable dip where brush had been trampled down long ago, I hesitated. The place looked forgotten, like it had been left alone for decades. Yet there was something unnatural in how clear the path still appeared, almost as though it wanted me to follow. My curiosity won, as it usually did. I walked for nearly an hour before spotting what looked like stone walls buried under vines. My chest tightened with excitement. I had found the homestead, or what was left of it. A collapsed cabin sat half hidden under a canopy of branches, its chimney jutting skyward like a crooked finger. I stepped closer, my boot sinking into soft earth that smelled strongly of rot. The place wasn't entirely abandoned. Strange wooden carvings hung from the trees surrounding the clearing, twisted stick figures tied together with strips of hide. They swayed gently, though there was no breeze. I should have turned back right then, but instead I pressed forward, fascinated. My mind tried to rationalize the carvings, maybe left behind by eccentric campers, or some artist's forgotten project. But the closer I got to the cabin, the more oppressive the silence became. Even the air felt heavier. Pushing down on my shoulders inside the cabin, the floor was warped but still intact. Dust blanketed the surfaces, yet there were signs that someone or something still came here. A broken lantern sat freshly polished on the mantel, its glass gleaming unnaturally in the dim light. The remains of a fire, no more than a day old, lay in the stone hearth, my breath caught in my throat. Someone had been here recently. I crouched to inspect the ashes, and that was when I heard it. The sound of shuffling footsteps just outside the doorway. Slow, deliberate, not a deer, not an animal. My body froze. Every nerve firing at once. I stayed low, my ears straining. Another step, then a rasping exhale that seemed to scrape the air itself. I wanted to shout, to ask who was there, but something deep inside told me to stay silent. I crept to the far corner of the cabin, pressing my back against the logs, my pulse pounding so loudly I swore it would give me away. The footsteps dragged closer, through a crack in the wall. I finally saw it, a figure tall and thin, its skin stretched too tightly over long bones. Its hair was matted in clumps, and its face, what little I glimpsed, looked like a mask of dirt and scars. Its eyes were wrong, wide and too bright, reflecting light where none existed. It moved slowly, as if savoring each motion, sniffing the air like a predator zeroing in on prey. It stepped into the doorway and tilted its head. Listening, I held my breath until my lungs screamed. Then in one sudden lurch, it darted toward the hearth, crouching low to the ashes. It poured through them, grunting like an animal. The sight was so surreal, so nightmarish, that I could not comprehend it fully. My only thought was escape. The back wall had a gap where the logs had rotted. I slid on my stomach, inching toward it, praying the creature would not hear. When I slipped out, my jacket snagged, tearing loudly. The sound echoed, and immediately the creature spun, letting out a guttural cry that chilled me to the core. I bolted, crashing through the undergrowth, branches slapping my face behind me. The forest exploded with noise, heavy steps pounded the ground. Snapping branches gaining on me, I ran faster than I ever had in my life. Every muscle burning, my lungs clawing for air. Then silence. I dared a glance back, and the path was empty. Nothing but swaying trees and shadows. I slowed, gasping, trying to steady my racing heart. But just as I thought I had escaped, a whisper brushed past my ear, not in English. Not in any language I knew, low, guttural syllables that vibrated against my skull. I stumbled, nearly falling, then forced myself onward until I burst back onto the main trail. The air instantly felt lighter, less oppressive, as though I had crossed some invisible barrier. I did not stop running until I reached my car, and even then I locked the doors and sat shaking for nearly an hour before I could drive. That night I could not sleep. Every creak of the house, every sigh of the wind outside sent me spiraling back into the forest. For weeks, I avoided the trails, and for months I dreamed of that figure, its eyes glowing in the dark. Years have passed, and I still cannot shake the feeling that it marked me somehow. Sometimes when I hike now with friends, I catch glimpses in the trees, a shadow too tall to be a deer, a movement too purposeful to be wind. And every once in a while, when I am alone in the woods, I hear that same rasping exhale just beyond the tree line, waiting for me to wander off the path again. I used to think nothing could shake me. I was 31 years old, a firefighter by trade, and I had faced more than my fair share of danger. Smoke-filled hallways, collapsing ceilings, the shriek of alarms. I knew fear, but I knew how to master it, or at least I thought I did. Until one October night, when Appalachia showed me a kind of terror I had never imagined. My cousin Derek had invited me to join him for a weekend of camping in West Virginia. He had grown up in those mountains and swore by their beauty. Their solitude. I trusted him. We had been close as kids, and though life had taken us on separate paths, his voice on the phone was convincing. Almost nostalgic, he promised me good food, campfire stories, and the kind of silence you cannot find in a city. We drove out together on a Friday afternoon, winding through narrow back roads that seemed to unravel deeper into another world. The sun dipped lower and shadows stretched across the valleys like ink stains. Derek pointed out old churches, forgotten cemeteries half swallowed by weeds, and abandoned coal shacks that sagged against the earth. He told me that each place carried a story. Some he had heard whispered by locals, others he dared not repeat. I thought he was just setting the mood, but later I would realize his words were closer to a warning. By the time we reached the campsite, the sky had bled into dusk. The forest loomed high around us, tall pines and maples thick enough to choke out most of the light. Derek seemed comfortable, moving with ease as he set up the fire pit and arranged our gear. I followed his lead, though unease had already begun to stir in my gut. That first night started like any other camping trip. We cooked beans and sausage over the fire, shared beers, and laughed about old memories. The flames danced against our faces, throwing long shadows into the surrounding woods. At one point, I thought I saw movement just beyond the tree line, a flicker of pale skin, or maybe cloth. I dismissed it as my imagination. Around midnight, Derek grew serious. He leaned closer to the fire, his eyes reflecting its orange glow. "You ever hear about the Watchers?" he asked. I frowned. "The what?" "The ones who live between the trees," he said quietly. "Not animals, not people. Something in between. They watch, they follow. And if you stay too long where you do not belong, they come closer." I chuckled nervously. "You are just trying to spook me." But Derek did not laugh. He just stared into the flames. Silent, that silence lingered, stretching too long, until I had to speak again just to break it. We eventually turned in, crawling into our separate tents. The forest was loud at first. Crickets, owls, the occasional rustle of a raccoon. But sometime in the night I woke to stillness. Absolute silence. I sat up, every instinct in my body on edge. Then I heard it. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving just outside my tent. I held my breath. The steps circled, pausing now and then as if whoever it was leaned close. Listening, my pulse thundered in my ears. I wanted to call out to Derek, but the words stuck in my throat. Then came the breathing, low, ragged, too heavy to be an animal. It was inches from the thin fabric of the tent wall. Summoning courage, I unzipped the flap, just enough to peek out. What I saw nearly stopped my heart. A figure stood there, tall and gaunt, its body draped in tattered cloth that hung like molted skin. Its face was pale, almost luminescent, but the features were wrong, stretched, twisted, with hollow eyes that seemed to drink in the darkness. It tilted its head, jerking unnaturally like a predator studying prey. I yanked the zipper shut and clamped my hand over my mouth to keep from crying out. The footsteps continued circling, slower now as if savoring my fear. Finally, after what felt like hours, they faded into the woods. At dawn, I stumbled out trembling. Derek was already by the fire, pale as chalk. He looked at me, and before I could say anything, he whispered, "You saw them." Too, we did not pack up right away stupidly. We convinced ourselves it had been a dream, maybe some strange trick of the firelight. But that night the watchers returned. This time, there were more of them. It started with whispers, low, guttural sounds that slithered through the trees, too far to understand but close enough to chill the blood. Then we saw shapes moving at the edge of the firelight, tall figures with jerking movements, always just out of reach. Derek gripped the hatchet we had brought for chopping wood, his knuckles white. "They do not like us here," he muttered. The shadows circled tighter, closer, until one of them stepped into view. Its eyes caught the firelight, glowing faintly, and its mouth opened in a soundless scream. My chest constricted. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but where? We were miles from civilization. Swallowed by forest then, as suddenly as they appeared, the figures slipped back into the trees. The whispers faded. We were left staring into the fire. Shaken and silent, we left at first light. Abandoning half our gear, the drive back was quiet. Derek never invited me camping again, and I never asked, to this day. I sometimes wake in the middle of the night, convinced I hear those same footsteps circling my bed. And every time I visit Appalachia, I cannot shake the feeling that the watchers are still there, waiting, patient as the mountains themselves. I was 24 when I got my first taste of life outside the city. I had grown up in Pittsburgh, surrounded by brick buildings and streetlights, and I thought the world ended where the skyline faded. But when my college roommate invited me to spend a week with his family in the heart of Kentucky's Appalachian country, I could not resist. I thought it would be a calm escape, hiking, fishing, and learning how small towns lived. What I found instead was something that reshaped the way I saw those mountains forever. His family owned a cabin about 40 minutes from the nearest town, a place tucked away between ridges so steep they seemed to swallow the sky. The road was rough gravel, the kind of path you take slow because every bump rattles the bones of your car. When we finally pulled up, the cabin looked like something out of another era. A wide porch sagged under its own weight, and the woods pressed in close on all sides. The first few days were peaceful. We hunted squirrels, sat by the creek, and let the day stretch long and easy. But at night, something shifted. The air grew heavier, the woods darker than they had any right to be. On the second night, his grandmother, a sharp-eyed woman who spoke with the slow cadence of someone who had lived her whole life in the hills, warned us, "Do not go wandering after sundown," she said. Her voice hushed. "There are things out there that do not want to be seen." I thought it was folklore, one of those old stories passed down to scare children. My roommate took it more seriously. Nodding without a word, I laughed it off. But part of me tucked her words away, not knowing how much I would need them. On the third night, I made the mistake of leaving the porch after midnight. The stars overhead were dazzling, brighter than anything I had ever seen in the city. I walked down the gravel road just far enough for the cabin's lantern light to fade behind me. The silence was deafening, broken only by the distant call of a whip-poor-will. Then I noticed something strange. The forest around me was too still. Not a single insect, not a rustle of leaves, not even the faint drip of water from the creek, just silence. My skin prickled as if unseen eyes had settled on me. That was when I heard it, a laugh. Soft, almost like a child's, carried faintly through the trees. I froze. It came again, closer this time. Though there was no direction I could pin it to, it seemed to float. Echoing between the trunks, my heart raced, and I turned back toward the cabin, only to see a figure at the edge of the tree line. It was tall and thin, its limbs long in a way that looked wrong. Stretched too far, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. and though its face was shadowed, I swore I could see teeth, long, sharp. Glinting faintly in the starlight, it stood there silently. Not moving, just watching, I backed away slowly, trying not to stumble on the uneven road. Every few steps I glanced back, and each time the figure seemed closer, though I never saw it move. Panic surged and I broke into a run. My boots hammered the gravel, my breath ragged in the cold night air. The cabin's lantern came into view, a dim golden glow in the distance, but the sound of that laugh chased me, higher, sharper, as if it was right at my ear. I burst onto the porch, slamming the door behind me. My roommate and his grandmother were awake, both of them pale and tight-lipped, as though they had been expecting it. She did not ask what I saw, she simply whispered, "You should have listened." I barely slept, jumping at every sound outside. By morning, the forest looked normal again, sunlight filtering gently through the branches, birds singing like nothing had happened. But I could not shake the memory of that figure. We spent the day chopping wood and fixing parts of the cabin, but my mind stayed haunted. That night, I refused to step off the porch instead. I sat in a rocking chair while the others turned in. Around 2 in the morning, I heard the laugh again. This time it came from behind the cabin. I stood slowly, gripping the porch railing. My breath puffed white in the cool air. Then I saw it again, just beyond the tree line. The same figure, tilting its head, its limbs twitching like a marionette. It did not approach this time. Instead, it lifted one long arm and pointed straight at me. A cold wave of dread washed over me. I stumbled back into the cabin, slamming the door. My roommate's grandmother was already awake, staring at me with eyes that seemed far older than her face. "It has marked you," she said simply. The rest of that trip blurred into a haze of fear. Every night I heard it, sometimes the laugh, sometimes footsteps pacing outside, sometimes scratching along the walls. My roommate admitted he had grown up with it, that his family believed something ancient lived in those hills, feeding on fear, binding itself to those foolish enough to notice it. When I left, I promised myself I would never return. And yet even now, years later, there are nights in my city apartment when I wake suddenly, certain I hear that laugh echoing faintly through the walls. I tell myself it is only memory, only paranoia. But sometimes, out of the corner of my eye, I swear I see a shadow too tall, too thin, tilting its head as if watching, waiting for me to come back. I was 31 when I decided to move back into the mountains. Some people thought I was crazy, leaving behind a steady job and a comfortable apartment in Charleston to take up an old family property in West Virginia. But I had grown tired of the noise, the crowds, the way the city seemed to press in on me. I wanted quiet. I wanted space. I wanted to feel connected to something older, something steadier than the chaos of daily life. The cabin belonged to my uncle before he passed. It sat on a slope overlooking a narrow valley, surrounded by thick forest on every side. When I arrived, it smelled of cedar and dust, like no one had lived there in decades. But it was solid. A stone chimney rose up the side, and the porch faced east, catching the first rays of sunrise. I thought I had found paradise. For the first 2 weeks, everything went smoothly. I worked on repairs during the day, patched up the roof, split wood, and learned the rhythm of the land. The nights were cool and still. Sometimes I sat on the porch listening to owls calling across the hollow, their low hoots carrying through the dark. It felt peaceful, almost healing. But one night I noticed something strange. I had left a lantern burning on the porch as I read inside around midnight. I heard the sound of footsteps on the gravel path that led up from the valley. Slow, deliberate, crunching footsteps at first. I thought it was a deer, but deer do not walk like that. They do not take heavy steps, one after another. Like someone pacing toward your door, I grabbed my flashlight and stepped onto the porch. The path stretched into darkness, the trees swallowing it after 20 feet. Nothing moved, no sound, just the forest holding its breath. I stood there a long moment, shining the beam back and forth, waiting for something to emerge. Eventually, I convinced myself it was nothing and went back inside. The next morning, I found tracks in the gravel. Not boots, not bare feet, something in between. The prints were wide, flat, the toes long and splayed. They trailed off toward the trees and disappeared into the undergrowth. My stomach knotted, but I told myself it was probably just erosion, strange impressions from water or shifting stone. The second time it happened, I could not explain it away so easily. I was woken by scratching at the side of the cabin. Long, dragging scratches like fingernails over wood. I sat up in bed, heart pounding. It stopped the moment I held my breath to listen. The silence afterward was so deep it made my ears ring. I stayed awake until dawn, staring at the dark outlines of the trees through the window. When I finally stepped outside, I found the marks. 5 long gouges carved down the logs near the window where I slept. The wood splintered in places. Fresh and raw, something had been there. Something with hands. I started locking every door and window, keeping the rifle by the bed. My uncle's old hunting dog, a black and brown mutt named Jasper, slept at my side every night. He was fearless most of the time, but as the days passed, I noticed his behavior changing. His ears stayed pinned back, his hackles raised at shadows. Some nights he refused to go outside. Even to relieve himself, he would just sit at the door, whining low in his throat. One evening, as the last light faded, Jasper suddenly began growling at the tree line, not barking, just this deep rumble that vibrated in his chest. I grabbed the rifle and peered out, but saw nothing but shifting leaves. Still, I knew something was there. I could feel it watching. Later that night, I woke to Jasper barking wildly at the door, his teeth bared, saliva flying as he hurled himself at the wood. I leapt up, fumbling with the rifle, and that was when I heard it, a laugh, not human, not fully. High-pitched at first, then sinking low like several voices tangled together. It drifted through the cracks of the cabin, chilling me to the bone. Jasper stopped barking immediately and slunk back to the bed, tail between his legs. That was the first and only time I ever saw fear in that dog. I did not sleep the rest of the night. Every time I shut my eyes, I imagined something pressed against the walls, something with those long fingers scraping at the logs. The next day I packed a bag and drove into town. I sat at a diner sipping burnt coffee, trying to calm my nerves. The waitress, an older woman with sharp cheekbones, asked if I was staying at the old Kinley cabin. I nodded. Her expression tightened. "Best you keep to daylight up there," she said softly. "Those woods got stories older than any of us." When I pressed her, she just shook her head. "Ain't my place to tell. But don't go listening if you hear voices. They'll call you out, make you follow, and if you do, you won't come back." I laughed nervously, trying to hide how much her words rattled me. But deep down, I knew she was right. Something was wrong in those woods. That night I left every lantern burning, the rifle across my lap. Hours dragged. The forest outside was alive with night sounds. Crickets, frogs, the occasional rustle of raccoons. Around 2 in the morning, all of it stopped. The silence hit like a punch. Then from the darkness came a voice, my mother's voice, calling my name. I froze. She lived 3 states away. It was impossible, yet there it was again. Softer this time. "Come out here, please." Every muscle in my body screamed to move. But I sat rigid, breath caught in my chest. The voice grew louder, desperate. Begging me to step outside, I clutched the rifle tighter, whispering to myself that it was not real. Then I saw it. A shadow at the edge of the tree line, tall, thin, moving with jerks like a puppet on strings, its head tilted, and though it was too far to see clearly, I felt its eyes on me. The voice stopped. Silence stretched thick and unbearable. Then came the laugh again, low, guttural, vibrating through the very ground. Jasper whined and crawled under the bed. Refusing to come out, I did not move until dawn. When the light finally bled into the sky, the shadow was gone. I stepped onto the porch, legs trembling, and found fresh gouges in the wood, deep, deliberate, like someone had dragged their fingers across it while I sat inside. I lasted another week before leaving. I could not stay. Not after that. I locked the cabin, packed what I could, and drove away without looking back. Now, years later, I sometimes dream of that voice, calling me out into the night, soft and familiar, luring me where I know I should not go. And when I wake, I sometimes hear Jasper's low growl echoing in my ears. Though he passed long ago, the mountains are beautiful. Yes, they are rich, ancient, and alive in ways most people will never understand. But some things in Appalachia are older still, and they do not welcome company. They watch, they wait, and sometimes, if you are unlucky enough to notice them, they will never stop following you.